Hello, I'm Doug, and welcome to the Krewe of Japan Podcast, a weekly podcast where we take you on audio journeys through Japanese culture.
This time on Krewe of Japan Podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. The genre of Tokusatsu has become one of the most popular types of Japanese pop culture media, not only in Japan, but worldwide. Kamen Rider, Super Sentai and Power Rangers, Ultraman, Godzilla. The list of huge titles and characters can go on forever. What if I told you that without Marvel Comics' involvement, it's very possible the world probably wouldn't have Power Rangers as we know it, or the giant robot trope in Super Sentai as a whole? Enter Gene Pelc, Marvel's man in Japan. An unsung hero in Japanese and American pop culture, Gene was the visionary not only behind Japan's Spider-Man Tokusatsu live-action show, but he also helped influence and produce Toei's earlier Super Sentai series, among so many other huge products both in Japan and worldwide. Today we are joined by special guest host Matt Alt, author of Pure Invention, How Japan Made the Modern World, co-host of Pure Tokyoscope Podcast, and, of course, friend of the podcast. Along with Matt, we briefly explore Tokusatsu and Gene's relationship with the genre. But then, we jump headfirst into a fantastic deep dive conversation with Gene Pelc and his son Ted, where we get a behind-the-curtain peek into the world of Tokusatsu and animation from the 1970s onward. Gene and Ted share insight into what it was like being on the set of early Kamen Rider and Sentai shows.
I was on one of the Kamen Riders. There was one scene where the monster was talking on the walkie-talkie and he was irritated, so he crushes it in his hand and blows up. And he's sitting there, and then they're waiting for 10 seconds while his hand's on fire, and then he's just sitting there not moving. As soon as they go, "Hayoke," cut, he throws that thing and just screams bloody murder.
How Gene played a pivotal role in pitching Japanese Spider-Man to both Stan Lee and Toei.
And we sit in a Toei screening room and we play the first Spider-Man, and the show ends and dead silence. And I'm sitting there going, oh shit, I'm done, I'm finished, I'm out of here. They hate this stuff. Except for one guy. Stan Lee stood up applauding, and he said, "This is great, Gene. This is a living comic book."
How Gene created the initial concept of the US version of Power Rangers.
So I made a reel. Stan loved the idea. We did it with Sun Vulcan.
Sun Vulcan was the first Power Rangers, but nobody's ever seen that.
Nobody's seen that. I make a demo
pilot
reel and I bring it over to LA.
Some other incredible connections Gene made throughout his career.
What a career, Gene. Spider-Man, Ishinomori Shotaro, the Pope. I mean, few people can say that they've had this many interactions with such hallowed presences in their life and career.
And so much more. This episode is a little bit of a lengthier one, but for a good reason. Gene and Ted share so much with us about their connection to the world of Tokusatsu, influence of Japanese animation studios on American cartoons, mixed martial arts, and so much more. It's hard to imagine what things would look like without Gene being the pioneer that he was in multiple industries, especially Tokusatsu. Let's hop into our conversation with Matt and then our interview with Gene and Ted Pelc.
Spider-Man.
All right, so today we have Matt Alt of the Pure Invention fame, the book, and also Pure Tokyoscope Podcast that we recently launched.
Thank you.
I want to give you some props because it's been phenomenal to listen to. I really enjoy all your episodes. So,
that's so great to hear. Thank you.
But you're also a friend of the podcast. You were our first episode.
That's right. I was your very first episode. Yeah,
you were. And I mean, I feel like you're the guru on pop culture when it comes to Japan, at least in my frame of mind. You set the foundation for a lot of my digging into. Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't know that, and then starting to look into different stuff. So, your book and just everything.
Well, it's an honor. It's an honor to be told that. But
and again, thank you again for hopping on. And we're sitting down today with Gene Pelc, who is really, for lack of a better term, an unsung hero in connecting Japan pop culture and US pop culture. I don't really think he's gotten a lot of exposure out west. He did have a couple YouTube videos that kind of documented his stuff, and he had a Disney Plus show that spoke specifically about Japanese Spider-Man. But that's about it.
Yeah, Gene is one of my favorite characters in the pop cultural pantheon, so to speak, because he played such a key role in linking like Marvel Comics properties with Japanese production companies. So he's mainly famed among Spider-Man fans as making the Toei Spider-Man, the Japanese live-action Spider-Man show where Spider-Man comes from the planet Spider and pilots a giant robot called Leopardon. It's a very different take on Spider-Man than anything we have in the States.
Definitely not Peter Parker.
Not at all.
No radioactive spiders.
But he also was really instrumental in some other shows like Battle Fever J, which is a kind of early attempt to commercialize Miss Marvel. And they changed the character's name in production, but Battle Fever J is another show that came after Spider-Man and it kind of linked the Power Ranger style 5-person teams with giant robots. So Gene is also really key in that by agreeing to put that robot in the Spider-Man show, he literally changed the entire direction of those Sentai Power Ranger style shows. The Power Rangers wouldn't exist without him, actually, even though he isn't directly involved in that making that.
That's so true. Yeah, and my son is a huge Sentai fan, so we've watched early seasons of like different stuff over the course of the pandemic. We've through various means come across the older seasons of the shows and Battle Fever J, Sun Vulcan, all those are the ones that Gene has really I think it was like seasons like 2 through 5 or 3 through something like that. The really early after Go Ranger.
Yes, Sun Vulcan, and then definitely. So he really is such a treasure trove of information from back then, and also not just live action. He was also the executive producer on a lot of those really popular 80s cartoons that were toy crossovers like G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, and my personal favorite, the Transformers. So he was an executive producer on Transformers the movie, which is, even if you're not a fan of the Transformers, one of the most exquisitely animated examples of hand-drawn Japanese animation that you will ever see, and I highly recommend checking it out.
Yeah. And like you said, a lot of people didn't even know that animation came from Japan.
Yeah,
and obviously,
exactly.
If they read your book, they do. But yeah, like all that, like he was instrumental in orchestrating the relationship between those the production studios in the U.S. and the animation studios in Japan. So we're gonna find a lot more out about that.
Definitely, real pioneer.
Yeah, and really unsung and a jack of all trades almost in what he's done. He's had so many different business ventures over the course of his time in Japan that it's going to be really entertaining and fun to listen to. But Matt, before we jump into the interview, I wanted to ask you your personal experiences with maybe Japanese Spider-Man, because again, we're kind of hitting on primarily the purpose of the interview initially was, the Marvel Tokusatsu connection, but it did kind of organically evolve into more of Gene's kind of thumbprint and fingerprint on so much.
Yes.
But to circle it back to Marvel, what is your relationship with Japanese Spider-Man?
When did I first encounter Japanese Spider-Man? I think it was in the early 90s when I was living here in Japan, and I was I made really good friends with a renowned translator by the name of Michael House, who did most of Anime Ego, that translation company, the anime release company. He did most of their translations early on. And he had, when I was living in Tokyo for a year during college, this insanely big collection of Tokusatsu on Laserdisc. And we would go over there and he would, you haven't heard of this? You haven't heard of that? And he introduced me to so much stuff. And I believe Spider-Man was one of them. And at the time, I thought it was wild. I was laughing at it. I mean, it's funny. It's really funny to think of this iconic American hero so thoroughly reinterpreted with Japanese sensibilities. But now, you realize it's just way ahead of the curve. Now we're into the Spider-Verse, right? Multiverses are the new big thing. So the idea of reinterpreting Spider-Man was really off the wall back then. Now it's understood that you do that.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned multiverse and Spider-Verse. I think the first time I actually heard about it, I didn't even know it existed until I saw someone share a Facebook video or something oh, did you know that there was a Japanese Spider-Man? Something like that around the time when it was either the comic book series of the Spider-Verse, Edge of Spider-Verse, or the movie. I forget which one it was, but they definitely reintroduced him into the comic books. But they also kind of had a little like what cutscene or something at the very end of the Into the Spider-Verse movie with Miles Morales, and kind of hinting at like him coming in later on. But I really didn't know much about it, and I had no idea that it played such a pivotal role in setting the foundation and the groundwork for how like all the Power Ranger, like Super Sentai series and Power Rangers would be not only marketed but developed over the course of time. Like that the big robots versus all those robots weren't in
no
they have planes and stuff like that, but
it's hard to imagine now looking back, like 40 years later, but the very first 5-man team Sentai like proto Power Ranger show was called Go Ranger. It was a huge hit, but its sequel, which was called Jacker, and featured 4 heroes using card suit motifs, like Card Club Queen. It didn't do very well at all. And so they were about to pull the plug on that whole concept. Mm-hmm. And it was only after Gene's idea of bringing Spider-Man to Japan and then working with the Japanese toy company to put a robot in it that they realized, wow, this is a winning formula. It's like chocolate and peanut butter, right? Like, you got my Sentai in your robot, you got my robot in your Sentai kind of thing. And it turned out to be the magical fuel that nourished the growth of this entire genre.
It did.
It's tempting to kind of view it as like campy and cheesy, but actually, now looking back on it, you realize just how much love and like handcraft went into making the series. Like the suit is handmade, the robot is handmade, like all of the effects are practical. There's like no optical effects except for like using models and things like that. It's just amazing how much handiwork went into making that show. So I can't see it as cheesy anymore. It's art.
Well, and it's not only that. It's like they'll touch on this in the interview too, but they really put so much. The budgets were limited, so the people who were doing this were really just trying to make it work with what they had.
Yes.
So you could really feel, like a lot of people said, like you feel the love and passion of the project going into all the
the
explosions and the costumes and
totally and just the playfulness of it all, because it's like why not Spider-Man with a robot? You know what I mean? Like, why not fighting like crazy, creepy guys in pleather suits in the streets of Tokyo? I mean, why not? It's the whole point of comics is to push the envelope of imagination, and like Japanese Spider-Man shows it's such a great case because it's almost like an A/B comparison. Like Americans did their best, and it's great. I love the Spider-Man comic books. Now here's the Japanese, and here's their take on it, and it's awesome too in a totally different way.
Yeah. Especially at a time when I would say like localization really wasn't. I mean, going over like you. I mean, again, he touches on it. I don't want to spoil too much, but it didn't translate well.
No,
to like that audience.
There was no context for live action Japanese shows like that at the time, because it was pre-Power Rangers, and it just looked cheap especially to the post Star Wars eye. Star Wars really changed everything, but like a lot of people don't know this, George Lucas went to Japan to kind of study special effects technologies before he made the Star Wars series. Because Japan was at the leading edge of special effects, practical special effects, suit special effects, and things like that for a long time. And there was very little in the West that could compete with Japanese sci-fi spectaculars like that. Star Wars totally rewrote the book, and Japan looked behind the times after that. But now we see it for what it is, which is just really charmingly handcrafted, almost folk art. Seriously. I mean, it's consumer product, but it's so beautifully envisioned and produced within the realm of its budget and what they could do. I wish it did get more playtime back when we were kids. I would have loved it when I was like 10 years old, I think.
Yeah. No, I mean, that would have been... I grew up in the Power Ranger age, so I guess I came into it, but I had no idea it came from Japan until way later.
Yeah.
But that
they
was
were still
part of the
hiding
thing, right?
it back then a little bit.
that was part of marketing. You didn't really know.
Yeah, definitely.
This is just a taste of what's to come in the interview. And it's a little lengthy one, and we, again, touch on a lot of different topics, but a very big chunk at the beginning of the interview, probably the first 45 minutes, I want to say, is talking about Tokusatsu and his imprint on Spider-Man in Marvel's thumbprint in Japan. Because, I mean, he was Marvel Japan.
Yes.
They basically sent him there and left him to his own devices.
Oh,
and
totally.
said,
Can you imagine just being
make it
given like
happen.
carte blanche to like market Marvel comics
Marvel.
somewhere? I mean, it's like they're like the Shonen Jump of America. You know, it's
Yeah.
like really it's true. I mean, they're the two powerhouses, one in Japan and one in America. So he really had the fortune and the foresight to be there at the right place in the right time. It's just such an amazing story.
Yeah, and I can't wait for all of our listeners to listen to it in just a few seconds. So let's just jump on into the interview.
Spider-Man.
Hello
Yep.
out there, New Orleans.
Hey,
That reminds me of an old song, Way Down Yonder in New Orleans.
yeah,
Because I was a disc jockey. Remember, that was done by Freddie Boom Boom Cannon.
all right. I actually
A little
didn't know
before
who
my
the-
time.
Yeah, I didn't know the name. I've heard the song. I didn't know who sang it though.
Well, going to New Orleans for Mardi Gras is on my bucket list.
Oh, yes.
Still haven't done it, but
Well, hey, you know, whenever you do come out here, and I'm sincere about this, let us know, and we will make sure we take you to a few places so you can enjoy
I
yourself.
haven't been there since 2014. Yeah, it's been quite a stretch. Yeah.
Yeah.
Teddy was there for a WWE.
I was
Oh,
working
wrestling.
at the time, so
You went to
had to go
WrestleMania?
down- yeah, I had to go down there for business meetings and everything because
Wow.
we work with WWE as well as several other, wrestling and MMA groups over here. So I just happened to go down there because, WrestleMania is a time where everybody can get together and actually talk. Otherwise, it's just email and phone. So
Sure.
I think we're talking about Tokusatsu today. So let's
Yes.
Yes. So speaking
That's for
speaking
another
of
day,
Tokusatsu,
let's get into Toei and the Marvel section.
No, that's okay, because usually we lead off with an introduction and with our first question being, what is your connection to New Orleans? And clearly, Ted, you have a connection to New Orleans. You were here for
I do.
WrestleMania.
Yeah.
And Gene, you had just mentioned that your bucket list item is to go to New Orleans for Mardi Gras, right?
Right.
What else do you think of? You had mentioned the song earlier. Anything else that when you hear the word New Orleans, what comes to mind?
How about gumbo?
Gumbo, yeah, that's for
I
sure.
just want to go back to Bourbon Street to eat and drink.
yes.
Well, the trick is the good stuff's actually not on Bourbon Street. You gotta
Yes.
shy away from Bourbon Street.
Hey, I need somebody like you, a real tour guide. I was on my own.
Right.
I wouldn't go so far as call me a real tour guide, but
Well, somebody who's going to keep me out of trouble. That's what I need a security guard with me so I can, do a little more investigating.
yeah. Well, I will make sure that whenever you guys do end up over here, I'll get you the hookup. I'll show you guys around and take you to a couple good spots for food.
But anyway, it was a good time and everything going. Now, I remember that because that was the last time I talked to Bruno Sammartino was in New Orleans at that
Oh, yeah.
time.
I was actually at the WrestleMania there. I went to it, so it's a good one.
Good memories of New Orleans. Would love to go back there.
Well, again, whenever you do, Matt, you too, obviously.
Oh yes.
Hey,
Oh
you guys will be
yes.
the first.
I am a dyed in the wool fan of New Orleans and its cocktail culture. I look forward to meeting up with everybody there.
Well, let's do it. Let's plan it.
And now
So-
away we go.
Yes. Gene, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you came to be connected to Marvel Comics back in the 1970s.
Okay, my connection. When people ask me what brought me to Japan, I say three people: a woman, Stan Lee, and Spider-Man.
In that order?
Tell me more.
I was going to college at a university in New York called Fordham, and I met my wife there. My wife happens to be a Japanese Eurasian, and when I saw her, I was thunderstruck. I looked at this girl and I said, "Oh my God, I've got to be with her." She was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, and she was from Tokyo. So we started dating, and I learned a lot about Japan at that time. And I started getting interested because what was going on was Japan, I had found out, was in an economic bubble. Everything was going very strongly here. And I say here because I'm sitting in Japan. In America, things were bad. Economically, there was a downturn due to the Arabian oil crisis, which pushed the price of gas and oil way up. So America was down, Japan was up. I took a number of trips to Tokyo and I liked what I saw. It was a clean country. It was on its way up. safe, clean, nice. I wanted to be there. And I figured, how the heck could I ever do anything in Japan? I don't know anything about Japanese culture. I don't speak the language. What could have worked for me? So I started looking around and researching what was possible for me to do. And one thing I saw in Japan, now this is the late 70s, is a tremendous proliferation of comic books. The Japanese call them manga. Mm-hmm. And they were everywhere. You could find manga in bookstores, subway kiosks, convenience stores, everywhere, wherever they were.
Yeah. Huge boom.
Everybody was reading them, kids, adults, women, men, and they were about all kind of subject material. American comics were basically at the time about superheroes. Mm-hmm. There was DC and Marvel, and they were kind of limited to young men viewership. Japanese industry was far beyond that. And I started looking around and I found no American comics. I'd go to a Japanese bookstore and I'd ask for an American comic and they'd say, we don't carry it. Nobody cares for that. So I said to myself, hey, here's something. There's no American comics here. Maybe I can do something with this. So that plants the idea in my head that there's this opening for American comics. So I go back to the States. I'm in New York at the time and I'm doing my radio disc jockey show. And I start thinking about the possibility of taking American comics to Japan. I didn't know much about the story at that point, but I was a fan of Marvel. My favorite superhero was the Incredible Hulk.
All right.
Because I compared Hulk to America, big, green, powerful.
Right.
So that was my favorite character, and it was Marvel. So one day I get on the phone and I call Marvel and I ask for Stan Lee, and somehow I talked my way into it. He didn't know who I was. I didn't know who any of they were, but I knew them was Stan Lee. So I made an appointment with him and I went to Madison Avenue in New York and I sat down with his office people. And I said, you know, Stan, your comics are everywhere. You're number one in America, you in DC, but in Japan, you don't even exist. You're nothing out there. I said, why? And he said, Gene, I don't know why. We've never succeeded. I said, Stan, give me a chance. I want to go out there. Let me figure out what went wrong with Marvel and DC out there. Maybe I can come up with an idea. I'll come back with a deal. If you like it, you got something. If you don't like it, well, you're no worse off than you are now. So Stan said, okay, Gene, I believe, go ahead, give it a shot, see what you can come up with. So I print a card of my name as a Marvel representative, and I go to Tokyo, and I start meeting a lot of publishers, and I find out that American comics just simply don't work in Japan. And the reason for that was not the stories, not the characters, it was the comic book itself. Japanese comics are read from right to left. The American comics are read from left to right. But more than that, an American comic book is meant to be read. A Japanese comic book is meant to be looked at, like a storyboard. The action's in the pictures. In the American comic, you have to read a lot of word balloons and a lot of stuff. So it was not comfortable for a Japanese audience to read. They just found it tedious. They preferred their style of storytelling. So I kept trying as a publisher, but frankly, I didn't succeed. I did make one deal with a company called Shueisha, and they put a Spider-Man comic in their very popular magazine called Playboy, Japanese Playboy. Mm-hmm. So we ran our first comic in the Japanese Playboy. And frankly speaking, it did not succeed.
What a debut, though. Why Playboy? Do you know why they put it in Playboy instead of a comic magazine?
It was a very big selling magazine. It was very widespread. So it was a good chance, I thought, to get our name known. So I talked them into a deal in which I gave them a deal in a 10-week run. And we did the introduction of Spider-Man. I don't know why I convinced them of it, but for some reason they liked what I presented, and we did do it. But it failed because nobody was buying Playboy to look at comics.
Right.
Buying Playboy to look at the girls.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never personally bought a Playboy. I don't think I have. And but I'm pretty sure a lot of people here say they read it for the articles. That's
right.
Right?
That's like one of the biggest running jokes ever, right? And everybody's like laughs at you when you say that, right?
Yeah.
Although I think that the Japanese one didn't actually have nudity in it, did it? I don't think it had like the American version.
Well, no, they had a limited amount, but you have to remember the laws were they couldn't show any pubic read. They always had to
still now
scratch it out, which is different now. But but anyway,
Anyway, what happens to me is the publishing fails.
Right.
I made a big step. I quit my job in New York. I sold my house and I went to Tokyo. So I had burnt my bridges. I had to succeed or I was dead. So I start looking around for other stuff. And one of the things I noticed, which actually Ted brought my attention to, is Ted and his friends were going to an international school. Mm-hmm. And they were all watching some TV which we're now calling Tokusatsu, was Japanese superhero TV. And I started watching that stuff and I thought, hey, this is great stuff. I love this. And I'm referring now to my early days when I'm watching things like Gorenja and Kamen Rider.
Yeah, those are classics of the genre.
Yeah.
Right, those were my introduction to that genre. And I thought, hey, this stuff is great. If we could put Marvel in here, I think this might be the way to go. Maybe comics books themselves are not right, but the TV show, all the kids were watching it. Comic books were coming from TV. Merchandising was coming from TV. So I looked around and I'm figuring out who did this stuff. And I found a company by the name of Toei. Mm-hmm. Was a film company and the producer of a lot of Kamen Rider and Gorenja. They, together with somebody named Shotaro Ishinomori,
right,
made what I consider to be the great tokusatsu of the time. Probably Kamen Rider was my favorite. So I made an appointment with the president of Toei. And I go over and meet him. And I said, listen, I got an idea. You guys are number one here. Marvel is number one in America. Why don't we make a deal where I get your characters from Marvel and Marvel try to develop them? You get Marvel characters and you develop them for Japan. So I made a deal with the president of Toei. And the first show we decided to do was Spider-Man, since that was our lead character. Mm-hmm. Spider-Man stands out in my mind in Tokusatsu for several reasons. Number one, it's the first Amerasian Tokusatsu. Number two, it's the first time the giant robot was brought into the genre. At that time, it had only been an animation. Now, the reason why a lot of people ask me, did you bring in a giant robot into Spider-Man? It has nothing to do with Spider-Man. Yes. I think it has everything to do with Spider-Man because the sponsor at the time was Bandai. And Bandai was looking for toys. And the Japanese shows were, I must say honestly, were commercials for toys. They were making these great metal die-cast robots and cars. By the way, that's the reason we have Marvel in the car. You don't really need a car to fly into a robot, do you? But
no.
Another toy. I said, well, look, if Bandai needs a robot, then that's a goddamn good reason to put in a robot into Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Yes.
Necessity is the mother of invention.
Are you're probably already aware of this, but correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is that actually the Five Ranger kind of concept had died out and they were planning on canceling it. And then when you produced Spider-Man, you re-injected this new hope into the genre.
As you say, the genre was going down. It had been kind of overdone. But because they canceled a number of shows, Channel 12 had an opening, an immediate opening, and Bandai was willing to be the sponsor as long as they had toys. Now, one of the problems Bandai had was the early shows had like 5 characters and a lot of other stuff they could turn into toys. Spider-Man only had 1 character, so we had to put these other things in. So I said, look, we need a robot. Fine, let's go. So we came up with that idea.
They had so much trouble with the Sentai series. Gorenja was so successful. I think it's the only Sentai that ran for 3 years at the time.
Yeah.
And when they brought the second one in, it failed. It was failing so badly that they had to get the Blue Ranger to play Big One in it. He's, by the way, Kamen Rider V3, and Kaikens is about that guy. They had to pull him in to pull it out, but it just wasn't as successful. And then until the third one, when you came in. With Kamen Rider, it was supposed to be one Kamen Rider, and that he was supposed to be like Inazuman or Kikaider or Akubai.
Solo hero.
He was a solo hero, but what happened was, those guys did their own stunts. He got in a motorcycle accident filming it.
Fujioka Hiroshi, yes.
Fujioka Hiroshi got injured, so they replayed him with
the second guy, yeah.
Sasaki, and that was the second one, and that's how and it's still continuing today. But there never would have been a second one that continued for all these years up until now if it weren't for that accident. So it was by accident that Kamen Rider is continuing. It would have been just one-off.
The Japanese industry back then was so fad-driven. Ultraman, which came out in 1966, was a huge hit, and then its sequel, Captain Ultra, failed. So I think it's kind of it happened again. Go Ranger, Five Rangers, the predecessor of Power Rangers, comes out, and then it kind of fails, and that's where Gene comes back into the equation, which is
with an American concept, Spider-Man, and they all loved the idea as long as we had toys in it. So we put toys in it, and it worked. The merchandising of the toys was huge. The money that rolled in was enormous.
There's actually very few portrayals of Spider-Man in the toy world. They're all the robot. You know, this company called Popey made the Leopardon is the name of the robot. And there are so many portrayals of him and so few of Spider-Man himself.
Which makes a lot of sense, right? It's Spider-Man, so they formed the robot not after a spider, but a leopard.
Yeah, it's kind of a little bit odd, isn't it?
But it worked.
Gene, did you ever ask Shotaro Ishimori or whoever, actually I believe it was Katsushi Murakami who designed that, why a leopard for Spider-Man's robot? Why not?
I would say, why not?
Right.
Because it looked good.
It did. It looked great.
You know, once you get it on film, if something looks good, does it have to make sense?
No.
Definitely not. It's the fantasy logic. I love it. Okay, so Spider-Man is doing really, really amazingly well. What did Stan Lee think of this when he saw the Toei Spider-Man? Because it's quite different from the usual thing.
I'll redo the first time he saw it and the first time Marvel saw what we did. First of all, I go to Japan. Japan is nothing to Marvel at the time, so they kind of cut the territory off. As long as you keep the stuff in Japan, they said, we don't care what you do. And nobody from Marvel really got involved. I did it all with Toei. As long as the money's coming in and you make good deals and the ratings are fine, we made our first show, the pilot.
So you were basically the international division, like CEO of Marvel, basically at that point.
Yeah, abroad. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not to mention, I'd stick a broom behind me and sweep up on the way out.
There was only one person who was Marvel.
Right.
When we bring all the people out, we're sitting in a screening room and we play the first one.
This is in New York.
This is in Tokyo.
In Tokyo.
So they all flew over. Okay.
Marvel had been bought by a company called Cadence.
Okay.
And the Cadence executives and Stan came out to Japan. And we sit in a Toei screening room and we play the first Spider-Man. And the show ends and dead silence. Nobody says a word. And I'm sitting there going, oh shit, I'm done. I'm finished. I'm out of here. They hate this stuff. Except for one guy. Stan Lee stood up applauding. And he said, this is great, Gene. This is a living comic book. Kids are going to love the action. Adults are going to think it's camp. Let's go with this. At that point, all the executives said, Gene, great idea. All right. That was the decision maker right there. We went ahead and produced actually a total of 50 shows, none of which ever left Japan. Everything was confined to Japan only.
Right.
So no Marvel got interested or cared or knew, except Stan and I would keep in touch.
In the West, I think they only knew the Columbia Pictures version of that.
The Columbia Pictures version of Spider-Man, which was the first Marvel one, was awful.
Do you remember that one with like Spider-Man? The costume had like the bottle cap eyes.
It's bad. But the Spider-Man I grew up on, the live action Spider-Man I grew up on was the Electric Company's Spider-Man in the kids show, the Electric Company. He's like silent. It's almost like an art movie kind of thing. He doesn't say anything. But the Japanese Spider-Man that Gene made come to life was on a completely different level from any of what the American special effects companies were doing.
The things that I noticed watching Gorenja and those early Tokusatsu shows, I started examining them and really researching what made these shows so good. And what I started finding out was the actors, the stuntmen, were terrific. They didn't use CG. Actually, all that stuff you saw was people doing
It was piano wires, acrobatics,
people doing martial arts.
It was at Japan Action Club. Japan Action Club.
Oh, it's Sonny Chiba's. That's Sonny Chiba's organization, is it not?
Japan. Actually, Sonny Chiba, people don't know this, but he made his debut on the very first Toei Tokusatsu picture. That was Nanaido Kamen.
Yes.
In 1958 or something.
Well, Sonny Chiba was Japan's Bruce Lee.
Right.
Now, when I think of that in America, I compare Burt Ward, Robin, to Kato of Green Hornet. And you know how much better Bruce Lee was because he could do all this stuff. In Japan, I found all these guys who could do this enormously
they trained everybody well.
Stuff. The first show we did, by the way, we had a guy climb the Tokyo Tower. Everybody knows how big Tokyo Tower is. In the middle of Tokyo, there's this huge tower. They bring out a stuntman. He puts on the costume. No wires, no nets, no safety, anything. They just said, go ahead, climb that tower. And he does.
There's like rules against that now, I think.
Maybe now you.
Well, it doesn't matter because now you see the superheroes and they're all fighting in front of Saitama Super Arena and the explosion
right.
CG.
I'm standing there watching this guy climb up that tower and I'm saying, geez, don't fall. Oh my God.
Actually,
Spider-Man will be over before it begins.
Actually, the actor of V3 almost died because you know those cable cars when you go skiing or something, they have
Yes,
like
the gondolas. Yeah.
Gondolas. He had to stand on top of one, and obviously they can't tie him down. And then when he was moving, he's doing all his stuff and everything. And for some reason, I guess the controller guy thought there was a problem, so he just slammed on the brakes.
Oh, no.
He slammed on the brakes. He almost lost his balance in the middle.
Oh,
Nothing
wow.
happened. When I was a kid working as a child actor and everything and carrying around explosives and everything, it's amazing that not
Wait,
more
hold
people
on. Can we circle back to carrying around explosives?
They made the child actors carry around explosives in Japan?
Well, back in the day, we'd meet up at like Shinjuku Station. I don't know if you know where that is.
Yes.
Like at 4 or 5 in the morning.
Sure.
And we had to do the locations where we blew up stuff very, very far away because there's not too many places in Tokyo where you can have motorcycles jumping up and down and let off that much.
Pyrotechnics.
Yeah, I mean, so we had to go. But then we'd always drive and pass by this like warehouse and we'd load up on this stuff. We bring a little bit more than usual in case it was a mistake, but generally we tried to not do bloopers on that because we couldn't reach
Sure.
times. Plus it was like it's not digital, it was on film. We had like big reels of film. So we were always profusely apologizing when we did a blooper because we figured that we burnt up film. Like now nobody cares, right?
Wait, so they put you, the child actors, on the same bus with the pyrotechnics? That's really incredible.
When I did it, I generally traveled with like the henchmen, the evil henchmen in the bus. And we ate together. And then the other people would come and we'd drive by like a warehouse and stuff, and then they would load up. And then we'd go to where we shot this thing. And probably if you look at some of the old ones, you know that place where it's just gravel. It's just
like a pit.
It's like a pit and a cliff. Usually a cliff.
Yeah.
There's always a cliff on the side. That was one of the best places that nobody would bother you. You can blow up anything you want and nobody bothers you.
The early Spider-Mans, everything's in the city. Spider-Man is out in the woods because of this safety.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But you'd be surprised. So few people got injured with all the stunts and all the crazy stuff we were doing. A couple of guys got burned. Like I was on one of the Kamen Riders early and when I was really young, and there was one scene where the monster was talking on the walkie-talkie and he was irritated. So when he finished the walkie-talkie, he crushes it in his hand and blows up. So they really blow it up. And he's sitting there, and then they're waiting for 10 seconds while his hand's on fire, and then he's just sitting there, not moving. As soon as they go, "Hayoke," cut, he throws that thing and just screams bloody murder right in the world for 10 seconds. He blew it up, and he just waited for it to go click. And as soon as that, and he burned his hand pretty bad.
But that's craftsmanship. Like he stayed in there.
A true professional.
Okay. So Spider-Man is getting made. So Gene, what is happening? What is happening after Spider-Man is getting made? Like this is a huge success in Japan, and so it must have raised your reputation in Japan, correct?
Well, this raises my reputation, not so much in Japan because I'm behind this. Nobody knows me. I'm basically in the business office or at the studio. As far as Japan, nobody knows me. Even in America, most of Marvel people didn't know who I was, but something was going on at Marvel at the time that turned very much to my advantage. Marvel was a New York City-based comic book company, but at the time they decided to get involved in TV. They bought a studio in Hollywood called the Patty Freely, which had been known for doing the Pink Panther. So they started a studio. They started doing Saturday morning animation and a lot of commercials for companies called Hasbro and people like that. So I'm sitting there. I've already learned a lot about Japan. I've learned about what Japan animation was like, and I loved it. The stuff that Japan was doing in animation was great. I mentioned earlier while we were in introduction that I loved animation in the States when it was great. Disney, Warner Brothers, enormously good animation, which became, in my mind, very poor later with Hanna-Barbera and Louis Spears and that stuff. It became very limited. Now, all the animation, which is expensive, hand-drawn stuff, was being done in Korea. I talked the Marvel people into trying Japan. I said, they do stuff in Japan that you guys have never done. This will be something different and it'll really work. Look at these reels. I brought them some stuff of what Toei Doga was the name of the animation.
The animation wing of Toei.
Wing of Toei. I brought them some stuff and I said, look, just imagine doing this. You guys do the storyboards. I'll animate it in Japan. You'll find some great stuff. And the first one we did, by the way, was a commercial for G.I. Joe, the All-American Hero.
Wow.
Now, G.I. Joe came on American TV. The TV just exploded in color. You never saw anything like that before.
Yeah.
And everybody said, oh my, look at this. It just jumped on the screen.
Right.
So, G.I. Joe, the All-American Hero. And nobody knew at the time we were doing it in Japan because it was after the war. Nobody wanted to know that G.I. Joe, the All-American Hero, was being animated in Japan.
Right.
Right. Because, I mean, there was actually a lot of tension between Japan and America at the time, not just military, but economic, in the 70s and 80s.
Right. There was still the remnants of the occupation was still here. So all you saw on the names were the people in America, the people who did the music, the people who did the storyboards and stuff like that. And the Japanese names were not brought out. So
it's ironic because now made in Japan is a badge of honor. Like kids want stuff made in Japan, but back when you were working, that wasn't the case.
Wasn't there a joke about that in Back to the Future Part 3 and said, no wonder this circuit failed. It says made in Japan. And then Marty, what are you talking about? The best stuff's made there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It was like, this piece of junk back then.
The flying car that Marty and Doc had. What about the flying car that we had in Spider-Man?
Yeah, exactly. That's true. Spider-Man's car is kind of the progenitor of the DeLorean. It's true. It flies.
A lot of people are unaware of.
Well, I think that Gavin gave the idea to RoboCop in the costume design. I don't know about the flying Spider-Man car. Anything's possible.
But no, RoboCop to me was the first American product that rivaled Japanese tokusatsu.
But the costume design was a little bit too close to that Space Sheriff Gavin.
G-Ben, I forget. Yes.
Well, there's a couple of them, but it was a little bit too close for me.
So the flying car is another toy that Bandai won.
Right.
So why have a car fly you into a robot? Why not? If we need another toy, we got it. So there's the answer behind a lot of this stuff.
Right. Just whatever works and whatever makes money. I mean, at the time, I'm sure you're aware of this. There's this thing called the media mix where the toy company and the production company and the television station and the publisher are all kind of working in concert to promote each other's products, right?
We used to go out at night with all the guys. They'd be the cartoonists, the animators, the actors, the people from Bandai and Poppy. There was a company by the name of Poppy, a toy company.
Yes.
We'd all go out drinking together and bullshitting about everything. So this is where I kind of got into it and watched the stuff that had been made before. And you know how Spider-Man in the first show changes into his costume? He jumps up in the air, does a backflip, lands, and he's Spider-Man.
Yes.
But kids love it. They don't have to see what's into the thing. Wow, they go, look at that, Spider-Man.
Well, henshin poses started quite early on, and now you have to have them.
Yeah,
definitely.
I think some of the Kamen Rider henshins of the past 10 years have kind of been a little lame compared to the old ones where, I mean, they had so much strength in it. They had to put all this useless effort in, they were almost looked like they were constipated or something. And there was so much, it was really made an impact. It was like, wow, that's cool. And now they're just stuff a card in like a cell phone or something.
Whatever the iteration is, right? It's just like
it seems
a key or something.
Well, Kamen Rider doesn't even ride a bike anymore. Isn't he like riding a train? It's something. He's driving a car. And
soon they'll be riding taxis and things.
Exactly. Kamen Rider hailing a taxi.
If he was still alive, I don't think he'd be happy with a lot of
car. Was it ride sharing?
Exactly, ride share, common ride sharing, exactly. So, Gene, you must have come into contact, as you said, you went out drinking with these people and stuff like that, and kind of culturally exchanging, business exchanging. Did you have a close working relationship with Ishinomori Shotaro, the guy who designed so many of these live action shows?
He's the first guy who kind of helped me. Now, I always referred to him as the Stan Lee of Japan. Call Tezuka Osamu the Walt Disney of Japan. I'd call Ishinomori. And by the way, at that time, he was Ishimori, not Ishinomori. Right. And he and I got friendly. We hit it off. I'd go to his house. He'd come to my place, and we'd be...
His house was awesome. I loved going to his place.
Yeah, tell me about his house. Ted,
what about his house?
He had like one of these big, giant... God, how much it must have been like a 10-foot Kamen Rider figure inside his garden. Really? I thought that was so cool. And then when you go in his study and everything, he has all the books and a whole bunch, because it's not just Gorenja and Kamen Rider. It was like Akumizer 3, and it was like Kyodai, even the funny stuff like Robocon and stuff that and they had, everything was his, animation and everything. Well, he was
so prolific.
Yeah. Everything, So
what was he like as a person? Was he a sort of gentle person? Was he a boisterous person? What was
nice
he more like?
I recall Tezuka as being the nicest. He was always want to talk to me and everything. He was the last one I saw.
Well, Tezuka was actually a doctor.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know. Ishinomori Sensei, he was really fun as a kid to be with. Guy. He was really fun to be with. I loved going to his house.
He was a grown-up kid, actually.
Well, he was kind of like Stan Lee. He always, no matter how old he got, he was young at heart. And, it didn't matter how old or how young the person was, he could carry a conversation at the same level.
And by the way, the first time Stan and he met, they had a great time together. They would, even though they couldn't speak each other's language, they could.
Is this Ishimori or Tezuka and Stan Lee?
Ishimori.
Oh, okay.
Ishimori and Stan.
Yeah. Wow, to have been a fly on the wall. I wish I could have interpreted. That would have been so great.
Didn't matter. They were on the same frequency, so I guess it worked.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Was it a little bit of a no communication going on, or was this when
no communication,
the pre-drinking phase of discussions?
Yeah, was Ishimori a drinker? Was he like a party kind of guy, or was he more laid back?
That was more the president of Toei, wasn't it, with you?
The president of Toei was a big drinker. Mm-hmm. He was the king of the Ginza, go out with all the hostess bars and stuff like that. Ishinomori was more of a family man.
I see. So what did you work on post Spider-Man? I believe there was a series called Battle Fever J that used Marvel characters. Were you involved in that too?
Well, I had originally signed a 3-year deal with Toei and Marvel.
Was it 5?
Was it 5 years?
I thought it was 5. What I remember, because you went from you made Battle Fever J, then you made Denji Man, then you made Sun Vulcan.
So anyway, Spider-Man.
Wow.
Spider-Man finishes his run. We go to series 2. What are we going to do? And I came up with a very loose adaptation of the Avengers, but Captain America couldn't work. So we made it Captain Japan, being this was Japanese. So
had to be a leader.
But actually,
the character Miss America was owned by Marvel.
Yes.
That one character. The other ones were made up for Toei.
Right. Was that Miss Marvel? Was that who it was supposed to be? Is that?
But it was Miss America.
And it was actually was she played by an American actress?
Diane Marvel.
Yeah. Couldn't speak any Japanese, right?
Her Japanese was so poor that they had to use the Pink Ranger from Gorenja to not only do the voice for her, but also do her stunts for her in the costume.
Did she eventually leave the show early, or did they replace her? Or she stuck it out to the...
She left the show early, and then they replaced her with a full Japanese. They're like, oh, that's too much trouble. Let's get somebody who can speak so we don't have to go through that trouble again. But it was actually Lisa Komaki, the person who played the Pink Ranger in the original Gorenja.
I see.
Who did all of her stunts in the costume, plus did her voiceover. So if you listen to the voice, it's the same voice. But it's funny, even with animation, if you have the same voice actor doing 2 or 3 characters, nobody notices until you say something and you're like, same voice. How come Ted sounds like Peter Griffin? It's like nobody notices this kind of stuff until it's mentioned. But look at it.
It's fascinating to me because Gene's work, I mean...
Spider-Man to Battle Fever J, the only thing we carry over is the robot, because that made so damn much money that we couldn't take it out. So that gets put in, that changes Tokusatsu.
Forever.
We've always had the giant robot.
It was always my favorite part.
Yeah.
But Gene, you were basically inventing the Marvel Cinematic Universe in Japan decades before it became a thing in America. I mean, this is really pioneering stuff.
We were cut off from America. I really was in a different planet. Toei and I were doing the stuff.
Right.
As long as the checks kept rolling in every month, Marvel was happy. They didn't need to see me.
Well, actually, without the internet and everything, you were on a different planet because did not go back and forth.
So a lot of these shows were they were co-produced by Toei and Marvel. Was Marvel's involvement was pretty much just you, correct? Or was it there other people? There were no other people involved, just you.
Well, you were constantly talking to Stan. I remember you were.
I was either on the phone or I was on something called a telex.
A telex, yes.
You punch the holes through that like, white tape, and you have piles and piles of like paper mountains.
It's like a ticker tape kind of thing. I don't think kids these days. I don't think modern day. Millennials have no idea what this is. That's old technology.
Nobody's going to know what a fax is, but
exactly.
These early Tokusatsu days I'm totally on my own.
Right.
In Japan, working with Toei, and America's connection was getting a paycheck every week, and they were happy.
Sure.
Plus, we were starting to bring in some of our toys, again. Then the big thing that happened was Marvel bought the studio in Hollywood, and they got into animation, and I talked them into working in Japan. Then I became very much a part of America.
I see.
Actually, some of the Saturday morning cartoons, we were cutting so close that I would take a reel, and put it under my arm and get on a plane and fly over to LA.
I remember the first you handed me a can of a big Pink Panther reel of like a 35 millimeter, a big giant can.
Was it a carry-on or did you check it?
Good question.
I think we did the carry-on because it was great because I always got to go fly into LA. I used to always go get free trips because he when he didn't do it, he'd give me the can to take there.
You're a courier.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, okay, what animated series were you involved in? Is brokering the word producing here in Japan? Do you remember what animated series?
Marvel producer in Japan.
Okay. And which series specifically?
Some of the series, Dungeons and Dragons, My Little Pony, Spider-Man.
Spider-Man and Friends.
Spider-Man and Friends.
I think your first one was Pink Panther. I remember that.
That was not for broadcast. That was for a test. I was going to prove how Pink Panther is a very difficult character to do.
It's the only character without a black outline on it, so the cells are
interesting.
And if you look at Pink Panther, the expressions are very, very cultural, very difficult to do. And I said, we can do it. So to prove it, they did a storyboard that we animated in Japan. And I think I told you the story, Doug, earlier.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about that.
Big problem we had was the cultural thing, which I was always involved in. There was directions underneath the storyboard that says, put a truck in here. Now, truck in at the time was a camera move. That's when you took it from a mid shot into a close shot. That's called a truck in. But
it's a zoom. I guess nowadays you call it zoom, but you always used to say.
Interesting. Okay. So just like linguistic differences.
Yeah. This is a truck in and a truck out, but everybody says zoom in and zoom out nowadays.
Right.
So we're watching Pink Panther, and suddenly in the middle of a Pink Panther scene, a truck drives through the scene. People say, why?
Why? It doesn't make sense.
And I'm looking at the storyboard and I say, put a truck in here.
We did.
Oh, and they did.
We did.
They did.
Speaking of trucks, so Bandai, Hasbro and Marvel and Toei were involved in a very big production called the Transformers. Were you involved in that at all?
Well,
yes.
Why did you bring? Because you and Stan did the Shogun Warriors comic in the 70s.
The Shogun Warriors comic.
I was going to ask about that.
Tell me about the Shogun Warriors comic. I want to hear about this.
That's where Transformers comes from. A lot of people don't know that.
So he did all the Transformers, the shows, but you also did the the movie as well.
Because Stan started watching these robots and said, we should do a comic book about robots.
Right.
So I came up with the idea of the
Shogun Warriors.
So we had that gradually
evolves
through the connection of Bandai on one side and Hasbro on the other side of Transformers, which became a little bit of a hit.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Yeah, that was a big hit. Yeah. Takara, I believe Takara was the company, the toy company on that one, I think.
Wasn't that Microman?
Yes, Mike. It started with Henshin Cyborg, Microman, and then Micro Change, and then the Transformers.
What was the title? Executive producer for Transformers? I don't know. If you see the motion picture or the cartoon, I think it was.
It is astounding to me, the level of animation in that Transformers movie. I mean, it's putting aside the plot or anything else, that just the amount of hand effort that went into each one of those frames is astounding. So, Gene, you were obviously aware of the craftsmanship of animation here in Japan. Were you like directly at the animation studios, or are you just conveying?
I was at the animation studio virtually every day, going through the storyboards, going through the dailies. I don't know if you call it dailies now, but a couple of minutes of what you had animated, I check it and say, that's good. No, that's not good. Let's go here. Let's change this guy. I was responsible for bringing in the Japanese animators that I think would work the best.
Okay. And actually, your favorite one was the one who recently passed away last year, Suda-san.
A Japanese animator called Suda.
Masumi Suda. I don't know if you know that name.
Yes.
His first
job was at Toei with me.
Was Speed Racer, the black and white.
The classic.
And then ever since, he's been doing, through the 70s, he did all those classic ones. And then he did like Hokuto no Ken in the 80s.
Sure,
and
Fist of the North Star.
Yokai Watch was his most recent work that he was working.
So I bring in Suda, and by the way, he marries the translator that I'm using.
You're midwifing this international culture and relationships. It's amazing. And so after Transformers, I believe you were executive producer on G.I. Joe, the movie, correct?
G.I. Joe, the All-American Hero, right?
Yeah. The opening of that is absolutely crazy to me. It takes place, it's like a battle around the Statue of Liberty, and it's like Japan's view of America in just like one cut. It's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. So you're really at the forefront of this internationalization, I guess, of Japan and America working together on this animated culture.
I was the bridge between East and West.
Yeah. Right.
But then again, it was 360 yen of the dollar, so that made it possible.
Yeah, that was another thing.
Well, we're heading that way again now, it sounds like.
Yeah, I know, right?
I don't know if we can go that far. I don't know if that'll ever come back. But
every day, open up the newspaper.
Americans were rich when they came to Japan.
Sure.
Because the dollar meant something back then.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we couldn't have afforded to work in Japan.
Yeah. I think
100 yen to the dollar.
Didn't you keep on doing the animation until about 220 yen to the dollar? And I think...
then it just got to, it wasn't economically viable?
No, because, I mean, the cost didn't change, but to the American side who were paying, it was a big change all of a sudden, you know.
So we started taking some of the in-between work to Korea. Say, we do a company called AKOM, AKOM. We do the in-betweening, then we do the main stuff in Japan, and they would do the in-between to keep costs down. And then we'd hire a lot of outside studios to do camera work. Everything was getting to be a real pressure problem because of the dollar.
This is amazing stuff. We could keep going on this all day, but I have to ask about the big 800-pound power gorilla in the room, which is the Power Rangers. So Power Rangers obviously is the descendant of Go Ranger and all of these shows. Were you involved in bringing that to the States at all? What was your connection?
It's one that causes me a lot of grief today.
Oh God, how much do you have?
Both my biggest success and my biggest financial failure. I'm sitting in Japan watching what's going on, and I'm saying to myself, look at this stuff that we've got in the can.
Right.
We have Go Ranger, we have Sun Vulcan. We own this stuff. I said, this stuff would make a tremendously great American cartoon. All you got to do here is cut out the part with the Japanese actors.
The expensive scenes are already done.
Scenes are all done.
Yeah.
Stuntmen in costume. The
explosions of fighting, all the expensive stuff, the shooting.
All you got to do is do the studio shots using American actors and cut in what I call duplicate negative, and use all expensive stuff. And you've got to show at 1/3 the cost that if you produced it in Hollywood. So I made a reel. Stan loved the idea. We did it with Sun Vulcan.
Sun Vulcan was the first Power Rangers, but nobody's ever seen that.
Nobody's seen that. I make a demo
pilot
reel and I bring it over to LA. We had a studio in Sherman Oaks, California at the time, and I show Stan, and he goes, incredible. He said, people are going to love this. And Stan went out to try to sell it to the TV stations and syndicates. But the problem was, at the time, Stan was still not the big name that he was. He was a New York comics book guy. He wasn't the head producer that he became later on. So he failed, unfortunately. He didn't sell it. I went back to Japan because I had to produce those shows that we were doing in Japan, Dungeons and Dragons, G.I. Joe. And a woman by the name of Margaret Lesh was president of Marvel at the time. She quit Marvel, took my reel, hired a guy by the name of Haim Saban to produce, and sold the show to Fox. They renamed it the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, which became a little popular.
Yeah, it blew up a little bit, didn't it? And that's a painful story to hear.
Yeah. And it was, if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned earlier that, was there a connection with Saban to Marvel prior to that? Were they connected with some of the, I want to remember.
There's this the Patty Freeling days.
Haim Saban was with the Patty Freeling before it became the Marvel Studio.
That's what I was, okay.
He was a big name in doing music.
Saturday morning cartoon music.
He was kind of the intros and all that stuff.
Men's movie. He was the biggest music producer for
music guy for cartoons.
He'd sit in a viewing room with Margaret Knows, and Margaret talked. Well, she was the one who made the sale to Fox, and she brought him in, and he believed in it. So that was Haim's connection to it. And then he saw me in a number of magazines. I had talked about how this could be done. I said, use Duke Neg, and you've saved 2/3 of the cost of a half hour.
Right.
Just cut to the American scenes with American actors when you cut out the Japanese actors. And I said, you've got a full budget show for 1/3 of the cost. Haim was later to take some credit for that, as you know.
Do you still have that pilot tape? I know we used to have it swimming around somewhere, unless it's melted by now.
Yeah.
The first one was a Sun Vulcan Power Rangers. Right. And it was basically based on this concept. And that was way before.
But the commercial part of it was the fact that it was so cheap to make. Such a great show.
It's a shame that it played out that way, but nothing can change the fact that you were so instrumental in laying all the groundwork for this and being the bridge between America and Japan. And absolutely, it sounds to me, would not have happened in any way, shape, or form without your hard work and persistence there. So that is a really amazing story an untold story, I think, from the Japan and American pop cultural world.
Yeah.
The archives, the blasts of the past, the golden oldies from the graveyard.
No graveyards. This is pure heaven for me, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, for somebody who grew up on this stuff as a kid, it is so amazing to hear the stories and behind the scenes. And as you said, I don't think many people in Japan know this story either.
It's true. But now you know the rest of the story.
Yeah.
Exactly. That is exactly right. Doug, did you have anything? I know you said you had it's like 12:30 your time, right?
11:30. I'm
okay.
good. I can keep talking forever.
I can keep this up all day.
No,
you're cool. Whatever you want to go, we can keep going.
No, I wanted to ask you a couple more questions. First of all, again, like Matt just said, I mean, you were a pioneer in introducing, or bringing Japanese art. It is art, to the U.S. And I mean, we wouldn't have G.I. Joe, Transformers, My Little Pony, all these
classic, iconic things.
Classic, iconic, we wouldn't have these titles without your intervention and just bringing that to the forefront, like the ability to have those generated in Japan and brought back to the US. So, I mean, you just beyond Super Sentai, beyond Tokusatsu, but I mean, just in general, you've touched on so much.
You guys, since you're into this, let me ask you the question. What do you think is the biggest selling comic book in American history?
Comic book?
I know the answer to this, but I want Doug to answer this.
I'll let Doug try it.
Oh, man. So, not Marvel or DC or just anything?
Well, it was Marvel.
Any comic book. It was Marvel, but anyway, it's...
I was going to say, I bet DC was wishing the death of Superman was probably, they were hoping that would be the highest.
Right.
They printed it like that. But
now you're going back to another story from Japan. The first one that we did was St. Francis of Assisi.
Okay.
So it's a Bible story.
Yes, it's a historical religious story.
Right.
Now, how that started in Japan.
How did that start in Japan?
Yeah.
I go to church at a Catholic church. I'm Catholic. And a priest comes to me. It happened to be the 800th anniversary of St. Francis of Assisi. He said, Gene, why don't you guys do a comic about the life of St. Francis of Assisi? We could reach another audience that we've never reached. We can reach people in church, but we can't reach people in the streets. You're with Marvel. And I said, well, I don't know. That doesn't sound like something Marvel would like. So I said, is there any way the Catholic Church can pick up some copies of this so I can have a guaranteed sale? Let me try to promote this in America on a business basis. And they said, yeah, we'll distribute it to churches, schools, hospitals, anything that Catholic Church is involved in, which is huge worldwide.
You realize how many churches there are on the globe.
Oh,
Right,
it's a big
right.
number.
That's a lot of copies.
Yeah.
So I said, look at who is your distributor to reach all those points? And it happened to be a company called the Paulus Press. And I called Paulus Press and I said, Marvel is thinking of doing a comic book of St. Francis of Assisi. We'd like you to run it. And I teamed up with a priest who happened to be a big fan of comics. And he and I went to Paulus and they asked for about 1 million copies in the first run. So now a big selling Spider-Man was selling about 150,000 comics a month. Right. I sit down with the president of Cadence, who was running Marvel, and I said, look, I got this idea to do St. Francis of Assisi. And he said, Gene, nobody wants to hear about religion. They want superheroes. I said, Paulus Press is willing to buy 1 million copies up front for this print run. And he said, Gene, this is something we got to do.
And you did do it. You did. How was it? How was it received? I mean, when it came out, was there a lot of talk about it?
Yes, it was a huge hit. And it was so big that Marvel came back to me and said, Gene, can we do another one? And I said, at the time, by the way, Pope John Paul was a very popular pope. He traveled the world. A lot of people knew about him. So I thought to myself, and I had a connection to him through a Polish priest. I said, I wonder if the Pope would be interested in doing one of these. So I asked Marvel, how would you like to do one about the Pope? And they said, how are you going to talk the Pope into doing a comic book?
And it was during the U.S. the Soviet Union occupation and all of that.
This was during, right? Remember the Soviet occupation?
Didn't you have to get an underground pipeline or something to get the information back and forth from his?
So I had a friend who was a Polish priest, and he connected me to the Pope, and I had a meeting with him when the Pope visited Japan. And I showed him the St. Francis book, and I said, Pope, no, I didn't actually say it.
Which was first? I can't even remember which one was the Pope first or
Pope was second. I showed him St. Francis and I said,
right,
this is the first one we've done. And he said, how about I be the second?
Right.
And he went Pope John the second.
Pope John Paul II.
There you go.
Said, oh God, if we could do that, this thing would be huge. So they did that. That became another $1 million seller.
Wow.
So it actually outsold Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Thor, Captain America, X-Men, whatever you had.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing. I mean, what a career, Gene. Spider-Man, Ishinomori Shotaro, the Pope. I mean, few people can say that they've had this many interactions with such hallowed presences in their life and career.
Pump your book right now since you're on a third one. I guess it was a Mother Teresa after that.
All right.
He had nothing to do with that, but now he's working on a book.
I've written a book, by the way, about.
Oh, I want to hear about this.
We haven't told anybody about it.
I'm looking for a publisher.
Oh, so what's the book about? I'm sorry.
Okay, now many people are unaware of this, but of all the developed major countries in the world, Japan has probably the lowest number of Christians of any developed nation.
1% of the population.
1% of the population is Christian. The rest are not. That interested me. I started looking at why did this happen in Japan. Korea has a tremendous number.
Philippines happen.
Everybody, but Japan has no Christians. Why? So I start researching it, and I found out that there was actually a time in Japan called the Christian century in Japan, when there were a lot of Christians, Franciscans and Jesuits.
Yeah,
and
16th century, 1500s.
Going back to the 1500s, 16th century. There was, and then I looked into what happened there, and I found out the reason for Japan didn't like Catholicism, and they didn't like Christianity. They interpreted it as a threat to the shogun's control of Japan.
It's okay first in something political.
Tokugawa, I believe, right?
Yeah,
so
they wanted to stamp it out.
Well, actually, before him is somebody by the name of Hideyoshi. And during his time, he finds out that there's too many Catholics taking away from the Buddhist power.
Sure.
So he orders the assassination and crucifixion of the early Christians.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I've written the story of that.
Oh wow, that's great. Well, I think there's definitely a market for that.
Tokugawa comes in and shuts the door on Japan to the West, which was never reopened until Admiral Perry came years later.
Well, I mean, that's Shusaku Endo's Silence is about that, right?
What?
Silence by Shusaku Endo, and then later made into a movie by Scorsese, correct?
Correct.
Which failed terribly. And by the way, there's several reasons. My story comes before Silence.
I see.
What caused Silence? Silence is the story of the persecution of the Christians in Japan. What caused that? That is where my story comes in.
But it's not just a history book. Yours, you made it into a story.
Well, it's a historical fiction.
Okay.
Well, I hope we get to see it sometime.
There's characters in it to make it so it
make it more palatable
to somebody wants to see a movie.
Sure, it's a good idea.
You'll have to let us know once you find a
publisher.
And
I need a publisher. Maybe you guys can help me.
Well, maybe when this comes out, somebody's going to hear about it and reach out to you.
Yeah,
excellent.
One days he got a little too close to it, and he got too watching the details rather than the big story. I think he got too into it, where he'd show the story of a person stepping on the cross over and over and over till the point was, we got it.
Right.
He did big stories like, all of his gangster stories were classics. But when he went into this, I think it was too close to him, and he did not produce an exciting film. He was rather tedious.
Well, hopefully yours will be the antidote that genre has been looking for.
Yeah.
What caused Silence and the closing of Japan to the West. It's that story. Now, that has not much to do with Spider-Man.
I don't think that's going to become Tokusatsu, but...
giant robot.
No, not
giant
Tokusatsu.
robots.
No giant robot. No giant robot. No giant robot.
I was going to ask just a couple other questions.
I mentioned earlier that started in Japan that a lot of people are unaware of that we did. Ted and I had a lot to do with this. We started the forerunner of the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship.
Right.
There was a company called the UWFI, and this was a group of wrestlers who wanted to shoot, but their shooting didn't mean guns. It meant fighting for real. I had an interest in martial arts because I had an accident when I was a kid, and I used martial arts as a form of rehabilitation. I was attracted to this wrestling program that these guys were doing, and I produced a show in England called Bushido, The Way of the Warrior.
I've heard of that. I've heard of it.
Yes, I've heard the title.
I did the color for that show.
You were the commentary?
Yeah, I did the color.
That's funny. That is so funny.
It's funny because in that company, I originally came from the shooting. Now it's called Shuto. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Yeah, it was the first MMA company because the original Tiger Mask is the one who put together the first version of MMA. Actually, this whole concept started in like the late 70s with New Japan. But with New Japan Pro Wrestling, they were very secretive. So all of this stuff was like in the dojo and it never got let out. So nobody knew about it.
So if you take a look at Bushido, The Way of the Warrior, you'll find our names in it as executive producer.
And the Shoot Wrestling
pay-per-view. And then the next thing that I did was a series of pay-per-views called Shoot Wrestling, It's Real.
Nice.
So wrestling.
Anyway, actually morphed into UFC. One of our first fighters was a champion in the UFC, Dan Severn.
Wait. Dan, and he went on to be in WWE after that, right?
Dan Severn, and also like with the UWF movement, Ken Shamrock was, with the original UWF too. And
yeah, I was about to ask you because I know they were really close in terms of they trained together, right?
So it was kind of funny because like Shamrock and Severn would go to WWE. They'd say, "Oh, the WWE managed to grab some UFC grown fighters." It's not true because UFC opened in '93. Shamrock was already a pro wrestler in the '80s.
Yeah.
He was already fighting for Pancras even after UWF. It was way before he got, but I don't know. I guess the Brazilians were really good at
marketing.
A lot of the information that they didn't want to come out didn't come out, and they kind of had their alternate history of what happened.
We developed the Gracie Hunter.
What's that? No.
Sakuraba, Kazushi Sakuraba. He started with us in the UWFI.
Okay.
He beat all the Gracies.
Yeah. Him and Kamura beat the Gracies. And actually, Sakuraba wound up being in the UFC Hall of Fame, but they never talk about his UWF days, and they never talk about shooting or Shuto. But that's not Tokusatsu either.
That's not Tokusatsu. That's real. That's real.
No,
we're kind of going off in a different tangent. Right
no, it's all good stuff.
It's all good. It's all good. I was going to ask you about your notable projects or businesses that you've had over the years after Marvel and Tokusatsu and all that stuff. Obviously, you're working on a book or have it written, looking for a publisher, the wrestling and mixed martial arts. And then what else do you have business-wise going on?
All right, since after that, one of the things I got involved in was merchandising, music merchandising at venues.
Okay.
You ever heard of somebody by the name of Paul McCartney?
Oh, yeah. I think I've heard of him before.
I believe he's done a few songs.
All right, I did the merchandising for groups and artists such as Paul McCartney, Bon Jovi, Madonna, Lady Gaga, pretty much anybody else that you want to mention. It's come to Japan. I've done them.
I think you've done everybody with the exception of Eric Clapton. I think you've done everybody pretty much. I can't think of anybody.
It's pretty much if they came to Japan for a tour, you were the
merchandise being like T-shirts and posters and things like that.
Programs, posters, any kind of trinkets, whatever.
I see.
Okay. Buy and put in your pocket.
Interesting.
By the way, let's go back again. Duran Duran. That
sure.
Oh yeah.
That was the first one I did.
First one?
Oh, wow. In Japan.
Yes.
At Korakuen Stadium, if anybody remembered, that was before they built the Tokyo Dome.
Was this like, we're talking like the Reflex and like all of those big 80s hits.
The original.
So this is like that tour.
Hungry Like the Wolf.
Hungry Like the Wolf. Yes. Now I have the song running through my head. Thanks.
So are you still doing the merchandising and for like tours
until
when they do come? Until COVID, yeah.
Right.
Now I don't know what's going to happen right now. We're thinking of other projects and stuff.
Few things.
All right.
So, Doug, what are the fun questions?
The fun questions. All right. So we're going to bring it back to Tokusatsu for a second and ask both of you, Gene and Ted. And I think, Gene, you already said this, but what was your favorite Tokusatsu show of all time? And it doesn't have to be like a mainstream one. It could be one of those kind of side ones that we didn't talk about.
I kind of like Gorenja, and one just before that was Kamen Rider, because that sort of introduced me into the business world and the world itself. I'm aware of some of the earlier stuff like Gecko Kamen, but I was not involved in that. It was when I got involved in it that I really started watching what made these shows tick. Why are they so good? Why are they so attractive for kids, even who don't understand them? And I was looking at all the work that they did. The music, by the way, was excellent.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, the music is iconic.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I started listening to this and putting all the pieces together for Spider-Man. So that's where it comes from me. And I did like a guy by the name of Kaiketsu Zubat.
Oh, yes. Kind of the guitar playing hero.
I used to think of him as the Japanese counterpart of El Kabong.
That reference is one that I can't exactly follow, but I'll roll with it.
Yeah.
El Kabong, an American animated character who hit the opponent over the head with a guitar, and it was El Kabong.
Okay. Got it.
I'll have to Google it later.
Ed, you go.
I don't know. You took my answer was Kaiketsu Zubat, but because out of the Ishinomori products, and I've heard somewhere somebody's told me that actually Kaiketsu Zubat was Ishinomori's favorite creation for Tokusatsu. And it was played by Hiroshi Miyauchi, you know him. He was the original Blue Ranger in Gorenja, and he was Kamen Rider V3, and he was also in the second Sentai series as Big One. I don't know. He always strikes me as being like the best Tokusatsu actor. And I like Zubat because it was so different from the other superheroes. They weren't monsters that were exploding. It was more of a realistic superhero where instead of trying to take over the earth or do something, it was like a dirty politician who had a good reputation, but he was doing things, or it was a drug dealer, or it was like a gangster doing something, trying to steal somebody's property because he found that there was something buried in there. It was more realistic, the storylines.
He was kind of a Clint Eastwood, you might say.
It was grounded, right? It was almost more like a macaroni Western, a spaghetti Western kind of thing.
That's why
fused
I
with it.
Clint Eastwood.
Well,
right, yeah.
It was from the Japanese Wataridori series, and he carried the guitar, and actually he didn't do like the henshin poses. He had to carry his suit inside the guitar, which actually, when you think about it, didn't make any sense that he could play it with, but it made sense at the time as a kid. And he was very realistic, and I like the fact that he was the only superhero that could be cool in a bar. He could be drinking a whiskey, smoking a cigarette, but he still was a kid's hero that Bandai could make toys out of. And nobody else did that. And I thought that was so cool that when he was doing the Spider-Man things, I was like, God, I wish I could get that actor in Spider-Man. And I don't know how you managed to pull it off, but for one episode, you managed to get that actor to go in. If you could look it up, actually, that actor from Kai Kids is a Bat is dressed up exactly like Kai Kids is a Bat, and he makes one appearance in Spider-Man.
Yeah, it's kind of a crossover episode, isn't it? Like an unspoken crossover.
Yeah, because he was always like my favorite actor in Toei, and then probably my second,
is so great.
Like Fujioka, who, by the way, he looks great even at his age right now. He can.
Yeah, Fujioka Hiroshi is he's on TV all the time these days.
Could you imagine, like, after all these decades, he can still hop in to go in front of the camera and pull off that Kamen Rider act. He still looks damn good.
I'm just glad he didn't hurt his. I know he hurt his back. That was what you were talking about earlier on, but he seems to have recovered well from it.
Actually, that accident was like a blessing in disguise because nobody would know Kamen Rider. It would have been finished after that one.
Yeah.
It would have been like an Inazuman or something like that.
Right.
Or any of those old solo characters that there was just a one-off and then there was something new.
So it was just the publicity from that accident that you think kept the show going?
No, I think it's just because they replaced with a second one and everybody liked the second one. They said, oh, wow, maybe we can do a third one.
Like a built-in sequel, sort of. I see.
And like the Sentai series, it ended up just continuing forever. But if it weren't for that accident, it would have just been Kamen Rider would have been like a
one-off.
Or a Skyder 01 or Inazuman or Akumaizer 3 or a Kyodain or any one of those.
Right.
One and it's finished. And then
came and went.
So the pivotal points in Tokusatsu history are that accident and then Stan Lee saying he loves Spider-Man. Tokusatsu. I mean, because that kind of launched that off, and that changed all of Super Sentai for the better.
I feel good because he was Stan's favorite character.
Oh yeah.
He loved what I did with it. I changed it so much, and yet he loved that. So Stan and I he was my boss, but he was also my friend.
And I guess your pilot film that you and Stan put together, the first Power Rangers, or what would be the Sun Vulcan pilot one, the American one that you cut together.
Right.
Yeah. That started, obviously.
Not a lot of people are aware of is I did a movie called
the Dracula one?
Dracula, the Tomb of Dracula.
The animated one?
The animated movie.
Oh yeah, Toei's Tomb of Dracula. Yeah, that was that came out in the 80s?
That was my idea, and I brought that to California and tried to sell it, but it went nowhere.
Didn't it get canceled and you did it anyway with half the budget, or wasn't there something wacky with that? You went ahead without the budget.
I went ahead without the Hollywood budget. We had to do
They pulled out last minute the money or something. Well, what was that about?
Yeah, because I took this to a meeting, and I remember one of the TV executives watched it, and when it finished, he said, "This sucks."
Jeez.
Actually,
just to your face.
That's rough.
Jesus.
That's rough. I mean, visually, I've only ever seen thumbnails of it. I've never actually seen the entire series, but I love the idea of this cross-cultural thing.
The music was superb. Incredible. The soundtrack, if you can find that on YouTube.
I'll seek it out.
Yeah.
I'll check it out for sure. That again, but you get a big credit in the beginning.
Yeah, because I held that idea together when the budget fell apart. So we did a lot of things to keep the budget low, but it worked.
Yeah.
So it was a bit shocking for American audience, something that was done realistically like that. It was way before its time to actually see blood and people biting with real blood and teeth.
Right.
So that didn't go anywhere, but that's something else a lot of people are unaware of.
Huh. I see. Again, just another thing that you've touched that, again, we're trying to bring light to this because you've had such an impact on just all these different things that are huge, that people don't realize.
Touchstones, really. Touchstones of culture, not just pop culture.
This is kind of maybe off track. I don't know if it's on track. I wanted to ask you guys a question.
Sure.
I heard that there, and I looked it up. There's a rumor that in the ending scene of every Spider-Man that he did, it was the exact same footage because the costume got stolen. Do you know anything about that?
Who would steal Spider-Man's costume?
Let me tell you something. I want to clear this up once and for all. I don't know who started that. Number one, nobody stole a costume. Number two, if they stole a costume, Toei was cranking out costumes like you wouldn't believe. There was a new monster every week. I mean, they could have stolen 100 costumes and it wouldn't have made a dent in that. And I knew in the studios, I'd always go run to the warehouse, the guy who kept all the costumes in this huge warehouse. He was in charge. And I said, can I take any of your garbage that you don't need? But a lot of them, they would recycle.
Right.
And he would give me, and he says, I'm not recycling. And he'd give me a lot of costumes to take home with me.
Oh, wow. As
So
a
I
kid,
still
that
have-
must have been
Oh, yeah.
amazing.
I had a monster costume. It melted in the summer, so I had to get rid. But I have a couple of the henchmen's costumes and a couple
Oh,
of
wow.
that stuff.
Oh, do you have any of the iconic like Kamen Rider henchmen
Shocker
costumes?
guys or
Yeah.
anything like that?
I don't have the Spider-Man here.
I have one from this. I have a henchman of Sun Vulcan, and I have a henchman of Kamen Rider Super 1, which is kind of nice because I appeared in one of the Super ones.
Cool.
And
Memories.
a couple of the other things.
What a souvenir. What a souvenir.
But anyway, when I asked this old guy who was reaching the end of, he said, I'm going to retire soon because I'm really old. And I said, how old are you? And he says, I've been in the business since Gekko Kamen, so I'm old.
Oh.
And I
Because
said,
Gekko Kamen's the 50s, I believe, right? 40s?
Yeah.
No, 50s.
yeah, it was 50s, and the guy who created Gekko Kamen, by the way, that wasn't Toei. It was a different company that still exists today, but is out of the TV business. It was the same person who created Nanaido Kamen, which was the first tokusatsu for Toei.
Right.
I was talking to him, and I don't know why I remembered this. I totally had forgotten this until I heard this silly rumor that somebody stole a costume. Leopard and turned into the Denji Man's robot.
Yeah.
Oh, and
Take a close look at it. He, like I said, could I have that costume? And usually he'd say, no, I'm going to change this to do something else. Oh, this one I'm not changing. You can take this home with you. And then I take home. But a lot of them, things got changed, and they would, recycle them for different shows. Anyway, Leopard became Denji Man's robot, and look closely, you can see it. It's in there. Look at his back and look at the front. You can see it.
I'm gonna go look at the pictures.
A lot of
Yeah,
stuff,
definitely.
A lot of stuff are budget driven because the budget
Sure.
was so small. You had to figure out ways to cut costs every place.
Remember
Yeah.
the sword, how it lit up, and then that weird mushroom cloud explosion that looked good at the time, but now it looks ridiculous. When Spider-Man does it. That's expensive because that was, the top of the line special effects back in the day.
Yeah.
So they just kept on reusing that scene. So no costume got stolen. And even if it did, it wouldn't have been a problem. Toei knew how to crank out costumes every 2 seconds.
Well, when they took the crews out on the road, they would be shooting 2 or 3 episodes of it at the same time to save the budget.
Oh, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. It's interesting how much these kind of logistical things affect the plots and the way the shows are actually turned out. But I guess that's commercial art for you. You know what I mean? Like you said, Gene, necessity is the mother of invention.
You have to go from one city to another. There's a train, bus cost, there's hotel costs.
Right.
All of those could be cut over 2 or 3 different shows, and the budget split up so you could do it. It was a tremendous factor.
I remember as a kid, I was acting a lot, but God, riding the bus, that was a long time. I was like riding the bus with the bad guys and the henchmen and some of the posters. Like it seemed like hours and hours and hours.
Oh, I bet.
A lot of the Japanese actors telling me, Gene, you don't realize, because you're from America where you have this huge budget. We don't have these budgets to play with.
Yeah.
Right.
That's why an actor was also carrying props from one room to another.
We all used to picture, even like with the kids, we'd carry stuff around, we'd help them. And then obviously it wasn't dangerous, like with the explosives and everything, but like they'd hide the wires under the dirt. So when the Kamen Rider guy with the motorcycle jumped off the ramp, there was 2 nails, and when we touched the 2 nails, it would blow up. And but everybody was helping and pitching in and running around for that. So it was really like a family almost. It was like a group project.
I think that's one of the charms of Tokusatsu is that the actual actors, you feel them doing this thing. It's not CG.
I don't know about nowadays. Nowadays, it's probably they have bodysuit actors, and the guys aren't really doing
it. But
that.
at the time, it was all those people doing the stunts and the moves.
A lot of it, yeah.
And I found that to be very attractive.
I look at some of the Kamen Riders now, and they don't look very athletic to me. I don't believe that they're doing anything. I think
they do have a lot of suit actors and whatnot.
They have bodysuit actors, and the actors only talk. They don't do anything themselves.
Yeah. Right, it's split up like that, right?
Human beings.
Well, it's tough, I think. It's probably pretty tough to find that Sonny Chiba-esque, can fight and act at the same time. Fighting is a skill. That's a skill you have to hone. Acting is a skill you have to hone.
Yeah.
It's like finding a comic book artist who's also a storyteller. There's so many who are great artists. Some are great storytellers. There's very few who are both.
Yeah.
But on that note, gents, I actually have to run.
No, Matt, I can circle back with you. But I was just going to say thank you guys so much for joining us. It has been an absolute pleasure. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to sit down with us and share your stories. And I'm glad we get to share your story to our audience and let them know some of the things that they definitely, I know a lot of them probably aren't aware of. So I will also link to some of the other YouTube videos and like Marvel 616 on Disney Plus, where it features some of your other, like, some of your backstory and some other additional details maybe we weren't able to cover today. So I'll put that out there. And if there's anything else, just let me know and I can absolutely share that for you.
Okay, sayonara.
Such an honor, Gene. And Ted, it's always an honor. Excellent.
All right, guys.
We'll see you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
And that's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning into the Krewe of Japan podcast. We have a lot of thanks to hand out today. First off, thank you to Matt Alt for joining us for this episode as a co-host. If you haven't read Pure Invention or listened to Pure Tokyo Scope podcast, you really are missing out on so many stories similar to the ones you've heard today. Deep dives into a variety of pockets of Japanese pop culture. You can find Matt on Instagram at AltMattAlt, ALTMATTALT, and on Twitter at Matt_Alt, MATT_ALT. And you can find his podcast on Twitter at Tokyo_Scope, TOKYO_SCOPE. Check the show notes for more links, and check back to our inaugural episode where Matt was our first guest ever. And of course, the stars of today's podcast. A massive, massive, massive thank you to Gene and Ted Pelc for taking the time to share these incredible stories with us. So much insight into the business of the film and animation industries, as well as an oral history of all these interactions between iconic pop cultural legends like Stan Lee and Shotaro Ishinomori. I went into this interview thinking I'd learn a little bit about Tokusatsu, but definitely came out of this conversation with so much more knowledge on how Gene truly was a guiding hand for so many aspects of pop culture. He was a true pioneer in the pop culture sphere that deserves so much more credit and attention. Were you aware of Gene Pelc's impact on Tokusatsu like Japanese Spider-Man and his influence on the Power Rangers and other American cartoons? What are some of your favorite Tokusatsu shows? Share with us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok at Krewe of Japan Podcast, Instagram at Krewe of Japan Podcast, Twitter at Krewe of Japan, that's KREWEOFJAPAN. Search us on Facebook at Krewe of Japan Podcast, and on TikTok at Krewe of Japan Podcast. While you're there, give us a like, follow, retweet, share, or whatever else you want to do. We love comments too. Let us know how you're enjoying the podcast. Or perhaps, maybe you prefer to provide feedback in a more private setting. Send us an email at kreweofjapanpodcast@gmail.com. That's KREWEOFJAPANPODCAST@gmail.com. Speaking of feedback, if you're enjoying what you're listening to, go and leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast streaming app. Trying to get that rating game up still, y'all. Let's go. But seriously, any and all support is greatly appreciated. And lastly, don't forget to come hang out at Japan Fest on October 8th at New Orleans Museum of Art. We'll all be there. Or if you can't make it there, come out on October 12th at 6:30 p.m. to Stone Auditorium in Waldenberg Arts Center on Tulane University's campus. In partnership with the Tulane Asian Studies Program, Japan Society of New Orleans, and JET Mid-South, the local JET Program alumni chapter, will be hosting a discussion on all things Godzilla featuring Dr. William Tsutsui, with funding provided by National Association of Japan American Societies. We'd love to see you there. But that's it for today. Until next time.
Spider-Man.